Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to our lightning talk. My name is Jake. I'm a sports betting and gaming specialist at AWS, and I'm joined by Zach Maybury, the Chief Technology Officer at DraftKings. And today, we're really excited to talk to you about how DraftKings uses AWS Local Zones to showcase the value of this edge computing technology on a company in the regulated gaming industry and its end consumers. Now, perhaps the impact of this technology is best demonstrated by my most recent personal experience at a live sports event in Denver, where I had this great idea while watching the players compete live, and I'm thinking to myself, I have a great opportunity to just place bets live before the sportsbook odds update. And I guarantee you, I'm not the only one who's had this thought. So for those of us who have shared this idea, we likely had the same experience where we open up the sportsbook app, and before we have the opportunity to place or select a bet, the odds have already changed. Now, this just showcases an example of how a company in regulated gaming can use this technology to meet several requirements, such as low latency. Now, with that, I'd like to invite Zach to introduce DraftKings and why a technology like this is required.
Thank you, Jake. As Jake mentioned there, there's no gaming the system at DraftKings. We operate at the speed of sports. And so, unfortunately, that's faster than the speed of Jake, or maybe fortunately. But just a little bit about DraftKings. DraftKings, publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. This is a huge enterprise. So we have almost 5 million monthly active users. We operate across 46 different jurisdictions in the US and in Canada. We support more than 18 sports. There's thousands of ways to bet. And a point of pride for myself is not only do we have industry-leading reliability, uptime, and availability, but we do this at massive scale. So over 1 trillion public API requests are handled every year by DraftKings systems. This doesn't even begin to account for all of the inter-service communication that happens between our thousands of microservices across tens of thousands of computing clusters and nodes. So, massive scale here. A little bit about our products and services. So we got our start in 2012 in the fantasy sports space. So our fantasy sports app, you draft a lineup, you compete in contests against other players for prizes. So this is a pari-mutuel product where it's players versus players. Live in 44 states. Our sportsbook launched in 2018, first in the United States. Live now in 28 jurisdictions, actually, I can say now. We launched in Missouri earlier this week. We showed up for the Show Me State. And then iGaming launched in 2019, live in 5 jurisdictions. So this is an online casino gaming product. This is live dealer with video. This is online poker, as well as slots, table games, and similar products. And then lottery actually launched in 2012 via Jackpocket that we acquired a few years ago. This is where you can actually have a digital lottery experience. So we handle the procurement of either tickets or scratch cards. We process and digitize those assets, and you can do that all from the comfort of your home without ever having to go into the gas station, talk with anybody. You can get your lottery on. So I want to talk a little bit about gaming specifically here. This is where local zones become very important and in-state workloads become very important. There's really 3 key things to think about. There's more than 3 things, but these are the 3 key things. So at the federal level, there's this thing called the Wire Act. And really what this does is restrict sports wagering across state lines. So something that we have to be really cognizant of is when we place a bet, when a customer places a bet, that entire transaction has to happen inside the state that the user is located, the customer is located. Additionally, there's regulations that are specific to each jurisdiction. So every state has a regulatory body that interprets the laws that were passed and passes regulations and enforces regulations that are specific to that jurisdiction. So a company like DraftKings, we don't have the luxury to build something one way and deploy it everywhere like it's true in most cloud native solutions. We actually have a very nuanced and configurable product that we have to vary across across the jurisdictions we operate in. And then another important piece here is things related to account and betting data. So this is data residency, segregation of access and control, retention obligations. Each of these differ state by state. And so we have to understand what the regulations are everywhere. We have to build a platform that is flexible and configurable enough to support those regulations. And then most importantly, we have to operate with virtually perfect accuracy because we are obligated via our licenses to comply with these regulations. So there are traditional solutions here, and we do use them, and they are an important part of our solution. So traditional solution here would be a colo. We build our own racks, for example. This is really important. However, there are trade-offs, like with any solution. So really, I separate these, think about these in two distinct ways. One I would call physical constraint, and the other set I would call digital constraints. So on the physical constraint side, this is really about the upfront investment required, as well as the time to market, the physical time it takes to bring a traditional solution to bear. So if we are building our own data centers, or we are working with a partner who builds their own data centers, we have to work jurisdiction by jurisdiction, create capital expenses to acquire and procure hardware, bring that to those locations, deploy that, install that. You can be subject to supply chain or demand issues. You are responsible for your own procurement and deployment. And what that can mean is that it can be slow to enter the market. You can still enter the market and do quite well. In fact, a big part of our success is the strength of how our in-state physical solutions perform in the areas where we need that. But that's a real constraint that you have to manage around. I will tell you anecdotally in 2022, when there were a lot of supply chain slowdowns, this was a real concern for us as we thought about capacity management leading into the Super Bowl. Now let's talk about the digital side here. So related to the capacity management I just mentioned, the key factors here are really scalability, availability, reliability is how I like to think about this. And all these are related in a similar way. We like to control as much of our own destiny as possible. We can't do everything, and that's why having great partners like AWS is key to our success. But we want to limit the amount of interactions we have, the amount of external dependencies we have as much as possible so we can control our destiny. One of the things that's really hard about traditional solutions when you operate across as many jurisdictions as we do is each partner has their own SLAs, their own requirements. Each site even has their own performance or configurations. And so what this means is that in practice, your operational complexity and risk is just inherently way higher because you have to manage the deltas across all these jurisdictions. So this is where I think local zones have been a really cool part of our solution. We still have a lot of traditional solutions that are super important, but as we think about how us as a cloud native company, how do we do more things more natively, more cloud, local zones have been a key part of that. So I'm going to hand it over to Jake to talk a little bit about like what even is local zones and
Absolutely.
yeah.
So taking a look at the AWS global infrastructure made up of AWS regions and availability zones, AWS is able to provide compute, storage, and database services to customers all around the world. And today, I believe there are 38 regions with 120 availability zones, with about 10 more availability zones and 3 more regions being announced. And although these can be accessed from the internet all around the world, they still are physically located in a geography. Because of this, customers may not be able to meet all of their low latency and data residency requirements. Customers who face these requirements may also just choose to default to standing up their own physical infrastructure, such as co-locations, physical hardware, or data centers. As Zach mentioned, this is a lot of capital investment up front, and it takes a lot to manage, procure, and maintain all of these locations. So customers who don't want to do this, they can turn to AWS Local Zones. Now, AWS Local Zones help customers bring their workloads closer to their end users. And they're often located in metropolitan centers and industry hubs. They have the same core AWS services and experience that our customers enjoy on AWS regions and availability zones. And being a fully managed AWS service, customers can enjoy the same scalability and elasticity as the AWS regions itself. AWS Local Zones help expand the AWS global infrastructure. So today, there are 35 local zones across the world, with 17 more announced. And through these local zones, customers can enjoy the full suite of AWS services that are located within the parent AWS region that those local zones are associated to through a secure, high-speed private link owned by AWS. So let's take a look at an example of how AWS Local Zones can help customers meet their low latency requirements. Customers who have their end users who are physically far away from any of the major AWS regions. So in the United States, that could be any of the 4 major regions. They face a slightly higher latency because of the far network distance that they have to travel. With AWS Local Zones, customers who are far away from these regions can actually use the resources in these local zones to have a much shorter distance. So for example, customers in Texas, or the end users who are located in Texas, they can utilize the resources in the Houston AWS Local Zone, and that is a much shorter network path traveled. And as a result, they enjoy lower latencies. So we showed an example of how customers can enjoy a lower latency result from AWS Local Zones. Zach, can you show us a little bit about how DraftKings uses AWS Local Zones to meet their data residency requirements, specifically for your sportsbook business in the United States?
Yeah, so what you're looking at here is a footprint of our live sportsbook states. This was done a couple of days ago, so I think Missouri is not highlighted here, but like I said, we're live in Missouri. So these are all the states that we operate online sports betting presence. And what you can see is that we already have some overlap here with Amazon regions, and where that's allowed by the local regulator, that's our first preference. We're a cloud native company. The vast majority of our workloads do not fall under this regulatory framework or requirements, and so we actually run natively in the cloud regions. And so where we can do that for our in-state workloads, we do that. From there, as Jake was mentioning, we have more local zones that overlap quite nicely with the states that we currently operate in. And so I believe we have 4 live currently, with a few more planned on the way. But as Jake was saying, this is a great use case where he was attending a game in Denver. His traffic was going to the Denver local zone for bet placement. And then ultimately anything else that needed to be required across our infrastructure would come from a region. And then anything that doesn't have coverage with a local zone there on that map, we are still using our current traditional strategy for co-location, for building our own racks and deploying our own software. So our solution is really a hybrid solution here, where we prefer to be as natively cloud as possible. And as more local zones become available, as more regions become available, we kind of shift our infrastructure that way. So really our state-by-state strategy, what it comes down to is keep the regulated stuff in state where it needs to be, meet our data residency and jurisdictional requirements, and do that with a cloud native solution if possible, like local zones or regions. And then all of our unregulated services, data storage, data lake, offline reporting requirement, responsible gaming, calculations, marketing, and promotions, do that in the region where we get the best cost efficiency and the best performance possible. So with that, I'm going to actually hand it back off to Jake to talk about what does this architecture look like in applied sense for DraftKings from a region and local zone perspective.
Absolutely. So let's take a look at how DraftKings architected and designed this solution with AWS Local Zones. As Zach mentioned, the non-regulated components were able to be deployed within the AWS regions and availability zones. And then for the jurisdictions where AWS has local zones, DraftKings is able to deploy the regulated components for that jurisdiction, such as the bet placement, iGaming, or online casino. And then in the scenarios where there is a state with a AWS availability zone physically located there, they're able to deploy the regulated components directly into that availability zone. But how did they do this? So they extended the VPC and they enjoy all the same tooling. They extended the VPC by creating a new subnet and assigning it to the AWS local zone within that jurisdiction. And because of this, it's treated the same way as any other subnet within any of the other availability zones. The gateways and routing and scheduling tables are all updated automatically. And because the local zones are associated with a parent AWS region through high-speed, private, and redundant links, DraftKings is able to see and analyze all of the logging and metadata using CloudWatch and CloudTrail within the parent AWS region. So, Zach, with the scalability and flexibility that local zones provide to DraftKings, what were some of the business impact that you saw as a result of the deployment?
Yeah, so at DraftKings, we like to let the numbers do the talking. The right idea is the right idea, not the loudest idea. And the right idea is usually scientifically, or I would say is always scientifically backed. Some of the key things that we saw great improvement on here are P95 latency improved roughly 25%. And in some contexts, this is milliseconds, so it may not seem like a lot, but the reality is anything that we can shave off of each request, make it a little bit faster, delights our users better, our customers get a better outcome, and that's why we're here, to make those moments happen. And I wanted to illustrate here the scale here. So this is not a small, statistically insignificant sample size. Since September of 2025, so this year, more than 500 million transactions have been placed in this manner, achieving this latency improvement. And the number's higher than that. This is from a few weeks ago. We're in peak season with NBA and football, so this number continues to grow for us. And I think really what this means is a huge volume of our traffic is seeing improvement, not just from hardware gains or running in the native Amazon stack, but just even something as simple as being right on the backbone can mean a lot in getting back to your parent region or your other workloads that are required to ultimately serve a customer request. It's true that we have to take the bet in state, but there may be a lot of other pieces of information that are required from elsewhere. And so being able to bring that all together with lower latency, really, we have seen a great improvement in end-to-end user transaction speed, which has been fantastic. So really, I think the question here is where do we go from here? Now, one I already mentioned, we're rolled out to 4 local zones. There are others that match our jurisdictional footprint, and so our plan is to continue to expand there, which is great. Also push Amazon to make even more local zones for us so that we have more locations to expand to. I think the other thing, though, and going back to that latency improvement, I think this is really eye-opening for me, is we certainly have other workloads that we could think about in an edge manner that maybe historically we haven't. Maybe we haven't thought about doing edge processing because we were afraid that we would run out of capacity for our core business being in a managed rack that was scaled to peak capacity and limited in its horizontal or vertical extensibility. I think this is a case here where, especially as we explore more AI solutions, as we seek to get some of our customer data closer to the customer to make their transactions faster, the speed improvement we've seen from the edge network could be a very valuable part of that solution. So we're exploring what some of those features could be to kind of extend the in-state footprint in areas where that benefits and delights the customer, even if there isn't a regulatory required component. All right, so with that, that concludes our talk. If anyone has any questions or anything, happy to chat afterwards. I just want to thank Jake and AWS for having us here, talk about our successes, and share some of our journey with Local Zones.
And thank you, Zach, for being an incredible customer.
All right, thanks everyone.